Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. You're watching Culturally Determined, and I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. And my guest today is an old favorite from Blogging Heads, David Klion. David, could you introduce yourself?
Hi, a few years back was an editor working with Aryeh and Bob Wright and everyone else at Blogging Heads. So I hosted a bunch of these and I set up a lot of them. And these days I'm just a freelance writer and editor in Brooklyn, where I live. This is my room. It's not much bigger than what you can see behind you. I've written recently for the New York Times, The Guardian, The Forward. Actually, I think the pieces that I most recommend that I've done recently were in a smaller publication called Jewish Currents, where I've branched out a little from my usual Russia and politics beat to write about culture more. I had a long piece about Woody Allen and how he had sort of reckoning with him in the Me Too moment that I would love if you guys posted a link to.
Yeah, we can link to that. We can talk about that a little bit. It wasn't on our plans, but I did read that piece and thought it was interesting.
If we let's hit the topics we were going to discuss first. But if we have time, I might get into that a little. I freelance and I do non-media stuff to pay the bills, and I tweet a lot, and that takes up an inordinate amount of my life, which is actually on topic today.
Yeah, your Twitter account has kind of blown up in the past year or so. I think one of the things that you've kind of established as like like somewhere between a beat and a hobby horse is problems with the New York Times opinion section, and more specifically their regular cast of columnists, who you've been critiquing, and many other people. It seems like it seems to have come to a boiling point in the past month or so with some stuff that the occasional columnist and editor Bari Weiss wrote about and tweeted, and Brett Stevens, his recent work has come in for some mockery as well. And then they seem to just run weird shit like this thing about pasta explaining Trump or something. It's just so there's multiple weird things about the New York Times op-ed page. But what are you thinking about it these days?
Okay, well, I guess we should get a little background on what's going on there, to the best of my understanding. So, the New York Times, I guess, not long before the 2016 election, got a new editor-in-chief, Dean Baquet. I think that's how you pronounce his name.
Yeah, Baquet or Baquet, I'm not sure.
Yeah. Who, has made some significant changes across the board. And there's a very broad critique that definitely didn't start with me of some of his handling of the paper generally. It comes from a lot of different places. Obviously, conservatives have criticized the Times forever, which is something that he seems to be extremely sensitive to. And he's made much of the newsroom extremely sensitive to. It seems like it's a central cause for him not to be seen as the lefty, irrelevant New York Times, which for people who I think identify more strongly with the actual left, and I'd include myself, this is kind of laughable. The New York Times is seen not just currently, but throughout its history as the paper of the liberal New York establishment, which is not the same thing as the left at all. It's, it has an affluent readership, and that's obvious enough if you look at, who this travel and styles and fashion and everything are marketed toward.
Yeah.
I'm not that, or just what it costs to have a New York Times subscription. Some of my best friends are like that. I kind of grew up like that. I'm not, I don't mean to write that off entirely, but it's one perspective. Somebody recently, I'll get to the op-eds in a sec, but just the Times' general news coverage during the 2016 election and after has come in for a lot of criticism, largely for bending over backwards to be even-handed. There's a pretty strong critique that people like Nate Silver and many others have made of just kind of how they covered the Hillary Clinton supposed email scandal relative to Trump's innumerable scandals and perhaps most importantly Russiagate.
Yeah.
And just the vastly disproportionate coverage of the Hillary scandal and the front page, Comey news, which is obviously Comey's fault too. But certainly anyone who was involved in the Clinton campaign or the Democratic Party more broadly, or sympathetic to it, remains mad about that. And although I wasn't a Clinton person, I was a Bernie person, I think they're basically right. I think the New York Times did not cover the campaign fairly. And I'd say that with I don't want to make any excuses for the Clinton campaign, but I think that's a fair assessment.
Yeah, I would say, the kind of cynical way of looking at it was that the people at the New York Times, along with everyone else in the country, thought Hillary was going to win.
Right.
So they
were wrong, first of all.
Right. They were wrong about that.
When we say that everyone in the country thought that, the New York Times, bears no small responsibility for creating that impression, I would say.
Okay, that's true. So it's a two-way street. But they were, covering Clinton the way they would cover the president in waiting, and the coverage of Trump was more like, this is kind of a sideshow, and that's what a lot of the media did.
Yeah, and I think that is a perfectly fair explanation of why it happened. It's also, I don't think there's any way to say it other than, as with, for instance, the build-up to the Iraq War, something else the New York Times terribly botched, with Judy Miller and everything. This is a colossal media failure, like an epochal, generational media failure. And it's certainly not theirs alone, and neither was Iraq. But they are, the leading newspaper in the Western world, and I think it's fair to say they let that presumption shape their coverage. And we were all affected by it, and all media outlets we probably consume and consider respectable were affected by it. And, it was irresponsible to cover Donald Trump as a comical sideshow and not as, someone who realistically could be president of the United States. And in retrospect, that's clear. I understand hindsight's 2020, and I certainly wasn't as, I had a different way of looking at it at the time, so I don't even absolve myself. But anyway. Well,
I would just add that, Trump's election was the result of multiple institutional failures. Pretty much every large national institution failed, and the New York Times is a large national institution. It is the voice of the establishment, and so they failed along with the major news networks, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party.
I would put the New York Times as failures, or let's say I would put its autopsy of what it did wrong behind what the Democratic Party did wrong, which is really, how the Democratic Party has autopsied its own failures, which is really saying something, because I don't think anyone is terribly impressed with the Democratic Party's, self-assessment over the last year. I'm certainly not. But I would say that there's been more demonstrable effort than the Times, which straight up does not admit that they failed. And in fact, more to the point, I think since the election, has in some ways really gone all in on a strategy that makes a lot of people on the left and a lot of liberals really uncomfortable. They would deny it. They would deny they're doing this at all. But, you can see it in their coverage of, you can see it in their news coverage, both the way that they frame the Trump White House, often in the most favorable light, or with just kind of headlines. I don't have any specific ones in mind, but headlines and leads that can make really aberrant behavior by the Trump White House seem relatively normalized or equivalent with what past administrations have done, particularly Democratic administrations, or just the kind of bloodless ways of describing really unprecedented things in order to seem even-handed. And again, they're not alone in this at all, but they are standard setters, and that we could expect them to be better. And then there have been a number of really weird stories about, let's look at a Nazi in Ohio and make him seem like a normal person, or this ridiculous one they just ran over the weekend that was like, here's a rich white dude from the coasts who decided to just cut himself off from the news.
I thought there were some framing issues with that one. I thought that was an interesting story. I was surprised at the amount of online backlash it got, but but continue.
Or I would say, or just, any number of like, let's pay a visit to Trump country, which, is all based on the presumption, I suppose, that the typical Times reader would never go near a small town in southeastern Ohio. And so it's, up to the Times to explain such places to them. But at the same time, would they ever go to, a working class black neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio? And the answer is no. And the kind of people that are stereotypically being imagined by the Times editors would never go there either. And those places are no less legitimately a part of the country. And, in fact, a majority of Americans did vote, or of the electorate did vote for Hillary Clinton. And most of those people aren't Upper West Side elites or anything like Upper West Side elites. So it is this very skewed way of covering the country that, you can really see them trying hard, and you can tell from statements they've made that they really want to like beat this rap that they're a liberal paper. And the truth is they're never going to do it, because at the end of the day, their readership is liberal. They are based in New York City. Almost everyone who works there is a liberal. And I would contend, I suppose I could contend it in the context of blogging heads too, but maybe that's going to get a little meta. But I would contend in general in the media that, there's nothing wrong with having an ideological slant in one direction, and I would argue in the direction that I'm on. But I almost would rather read, the Weekly Standard or Breitbart or the National Review or whatever, or watch Fox News than see sort of ham-handed attempts by liberal institutions to be nonpartisan, which I think frequently misrepresent both sides and also just misrepresent reality. So that brings us to the op-ed page.
Yeah, let's pause there. Yeah. So just a couple threads to react to. I mean, one is this idea that like Trump is an unprecedented threat to norms and standards of governance that have been built up in America carefully. And how does the like bloodless view from nowhere style of the mainstream media respond to that? So one question is like, there's a fact that Trump lies all the time, and everyone knows this. Even his supporters know that he like bullshits and lies constantly. The New York Times does not want to say Donald Trump lied. They'll want to say like, well, there were differing perspectives on this one,
right? Or
the facts showed that Mr. Trump maybe was not entirely accurate as he could have been. So they always couch it in this bloodless way. And, what should we do about the fact that Trump lies all the time? Does the fact that Trump lies all the time mean we need to break the norm that the paper doesn't accuse someone of lying unless, like, we know that, like, they would be convicted of libel in a court of law? Or should we keep the standard? Should we junk the standard? I'm not sure where I end up on that.
It's a fact that he lies. And the Times probably has, in some contexts, actually done good jobs of fact checking him. I'm not someone who keeps an extremely close watch on this stuff. But I think, if he says something that is untrue, it should be made as clear as possible. And it is not partisan to, that is not true. But I think it's often more a question of framing. And, why do they do this? I mean, it's partly so no one accuses them of bias. It's partly for access. It's partly because they need to effectively cover, both parties and both parties in Congress, and cover the Trump White House, where they have some very plugged-in reporters. And, Trump will go on Twitter if he doesn't like the coverage, and he'll talk about the failing New York Times. And, the truth is he'll do that anyway. I mean, the other day he said, like, I think it was yesterday, he was like, who is this ridiculous woman, Maggie Haberman? She has no access to me. No one talks to her. She's nobody. And people were like circulating this picture of them, like, hugging it out in the Oval Office.
If you read,
media knows Maggie Haberman can get Trump on the phone.
Yeah. If you read Maggie Haberman
in the middle of the night to like just kibitz with her, because he really does care what New York journalists think of him and New York Times journalists think of him.
Yeah. That's one of the like,
of his.
Yeah. The like, one of the most bizarre ironies is that he presents himself as this tribune of the people, but really all he wants is like a favorable cover on the New York Post the next day. Like that's like Donald Trump smiling on the New York Post is like a win,
well,
like the biggest win possible.
and above all the Times, because, there's the whole thing about him being this outer borough kid who, no matter how rich he is, they don't take him seriously in Manhattan, and and that never goes away. But so, but whether that were the case or not, I understand the need for access. I understand the need to compete with the Washington Post and Politico and Axios and whoever on getting White House scoops. But like, there are bigger stories than who's mad at who in the White House today. Although I should say that today's breaking news is a pretty huge story about who's mad at whom in the White House today.
Right. But so we're taping this on Tuesday. So who knows what will happen tomorrow?
Today is the day that Tillerson was fired.
Tillerson was fired. This guy who was like Trump's body man got apparently escorted from the White House premises yesterday because he is accused of some kind of financial misdeed or something like that. And but who knows what will happen tomorrow?
More on that anon. But for now, let's just say that a lot of the palace intrigue stuff, I mean, it's important and it should be covered, but not at the expense of, being bluntly truthful about what these people are like. And, a lot of the Times coverage, I mean, I feel like there's been a lot of, a person close to Jared and Ivanka said, which, every savvy media observer understands means Jared and Ivanka said. And it's like, put them on the record or not, or like burn your sources occasionally, especially if they lie, show them that there's a penalty for lying.
Yeah.
And if you lose some sources as a result, at least you told the public the truth. I mean, there's a reason why the Michael Wolff Fire and Fury book, which it's clear that all the White House reporters at the Times and everywhere else hated that book and hate Michael Wolff. But that book, I think, did the public a service, even though there are some sloppy parts to it.
Yeah, I was just thinking today.
He camped out in the White House, had this ridiculous access, and then he told the truth that, probably fudging it here and there, but basically told the truth about what he saw. And I think the public has a much clearer view of how fucking insane the Trump White House is.
Yeah, I was just thinking today that there wasn't a single large fact from that book that was shown to be false. Like he got some details wrong, and
I don't think he got anything more wrong than the average reporter does. It's just little bits here and there.
He was fundamentally correct about the madhouse. I agree with that. Okay, so let's talk about
but that's Michael Wolff, who's not someone I had like a great deal of admiration for, certainly not before all this. But I have to say, I've never encountered him in any way, but by most accounts, he's not well liked in journalism circles. But perhaps precisely because he's a jerk, and because I think he did do some flattering tricks to, dissing the media and normalizing Trump to get himself in the door. But it was all in the service of humiliating these people. Like, there was an actual goal there, and properly informing the public, and obviously having a best-selling book. There's a sense in which I admire that. I mean, I think that he, that I understand why that can't work for everyone all the time, but I admire the sort of chutzpah of really laying it out there, and I think that the public, can't ignore how completely unfit all these people are, and that this is not a normal functioning administration. Yes, but anyway, so that's just the news side. Let's talk about the opinion side, because there's an important story about that in the last year, and that's been my focus.
Yeah, so soon after Trump's election, the Times decided that they were going to bring in a new, fresh voice, and this person was Bret Stephens.
Well, hold on. We need to go back a step before this. Okay. So, in point of fact, the Times opinion section had been criticized for a very long time. It'd been run by a guy, I think his name is Andrew Rosenthal, and it was just kind of stagnant. And this is important to point out because there's a kind of roster that everybody knows of very frustrating or tired or self-parodic columnists at the Times. Tom Friedman, Maureen Dowd, David Brooks, Gail Collins, Paul Krugman, Charles Blow, I guess. More recently, Ross Douthat, who, although I have many criticisms of him and don't agree with his fundamental worldview, I think the smart take is that he's the best writer on the New York Times op-ed page. of the regular columnists, and the most interesting one, despite being very conservative. And that's because he's smarter than most of them. He's young, but not too young. And in his weird roundabout reactionary way, he actually comes the closest to making Marxian analyses of politics. I mean, seriously, he's the only one who I think really understands class as a concept. The fundamental problem with him is that he has this like reactionary Catholic worldview and wants everyone to have 50 babies or whatever. But, he just rejects the sexual revolution altogether, which I completely reject that. But he's not stupid, and he doesn't think that liberals are stupid or that leftists are stupid. And that makes him interesting to read.
He knows he's writing, so Douthit knows he's writing for a largely liberal audience. He takes liberal arguments seriously, but he has actual core beliefs, like he is a practicing Catholic. He really believes this stuff. I think you named them all except Nick Kristof.
And he understands the big weakness of New York Times style liberalism, which is its massive blind spot toward class. And although he is a privileged individual himself, and always has been highly privileged and, part of the bubble.
He wrote a book called Privilege, I believe.
He wrote a book called Privilege, but he grew up, I think, affluent in Connecticut. He went to Harvard. I mean,
he grew up in New Haven, I think, although I don't know if his family was attached to Yale or not.
He's lived his whole life in the Northeast Corridor and gone to elite schools. But despite that, I mean, so have I. But despite that, like, what makes Douthit interesting, I think, is that he reads about class, he thinks about class, he understands class as a concept, and I often get the sense, reading most New York Times columnists of whatever nominal persuasion, that they just don't. And somebody said recently that maybe it was Jeet here, I'm not sure, that the range of opinions on the New York Times op-ed page may not be representative of America, but it's actually quite representative of the range of opinions on the Upper West Side, including conservative opinions on the Upper West Side. And I think that's right, which is to say no leftists, one man of color and no women of color, very few women generally, and whether you're a liberal or, a conservative minority that is definitely there and growing. And then whether you're a liberal or a conservative on the Times op-ed page, you still probably agree on, 75% of things or more. You agree on, neoliberal capitalism, free trade, America's right to intervene in other countries, that only establishment candidates from the two major parties should ever, be in contention for anything, I would say some very broad socially liberal consensus, although that gets trickier on as far as where the conservatives are. But it's a very narrow echo chamber, and everybody's been phoning in the same columns forever. So that was the kind of standing criticism of the Times op-ed page under Rosenthal, which still largely applies, and all those people are still there. They do make up most of the regular columnists.
Seems to be it's like they have life tenure. It's weird. Like
it is weird.
So how long has Dowd's been there since the 90s? Friedman's been there since the 90s. So is Kristof. Yeah. Brooks since the early aughts.
Many of these people. There's Frank Bruni, who is completely useless, and wrote a column today about how the answer to Donald Trump is pasta.
He was a very good.
Went to Rome.
He was a very good food critic. I used to read his food criticism and enjoyed it a lot, but he has not written a single memorable thing.
Well, I've heard mixed reviews of his food criticism, but I think it is worth saying, though, that most of these people, before they were professional, tenured, lifetime opinion pundits, most of them actually did something. Maureen Dowd was a pretty good reporter. Tom Friedman was reporting from Lebanon and Israel and actually covered the Sabra and Shatila massacres.
Yeah, so did Kristof as well.
Kristof, actually, I will say, although he has his sporadic elements to his credit, still goes around the world reporting, so that's good. Yeah. And Frank Bruni was a food writer and so on, and it's like they all just suddenly get tapped in to do this. Or Charles Blow, I think, has written a very compelling memoir, but I haven't read it, but by most accounts. But I find his column tiresome, even though it's probably the one I agree with the most these days. But yeah, I mean, all of these people could be doing better things. And to his enormous credit, Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I think it's fair to say is the consensus pick for most important public intellectual of our time, whether people like him or not, or agree with him or not.
I won't name names of anyone who appears on
No,
this site who doesn't
I know
agree with that, but
critiques of him. Some by regular. Am I echoing?
just a little bit. You sound fine.
Some by regular Blogging Heads contributors.
He was he had like a year-long contract with them, and they did some experiments in the mid-aughts where like Bill Kristol was there for a year, Coates was there for a year.
Totally phoning it in, Kristol was. But with Coates, they were going to make him a regular columnist, which would have been great for them. But Coates, and he had been at the Atlantic for a while, but he hadn't written Between the World and Me yet, so he hadn't gotten the National Book Award and the MacArthur Grant. He wasn't writing Black Panther comics. He was a very big name, but he wasn't this like superstar quite yet. And he turned down the Times. He knew he was worth more than that. I don't even necessarily mean in money terms, although I'm sure it's worked out that way. I think he knew that he knew that writing, 2 columns on the week's events every week in this kind of stifling format would drain him of his originality and his talent, which is undeniable. He is undeniably a talented writer and an important thinker.
Yeah.
And I have my quibbles with him too, but his importance can't be questioned at this point.
Right. Well, it almost raises the question, like, can this form be done in a intellectually satisfying way?
Which I wonder about
comes
often. Close,
but like it's hard to come up with an original idea twice per week.
It really is, and I think that blogging, which this site was kind of built as a piggyback on, and which has been a dying art. There was back when I was working with you guys, and this was already have been like maybe 5 or 6 years ago. I taped a dialogue. I set one up between Alyssa Rosenberg and Mark Tracy, and they had both come up in blogging, and Mark had won an award for his blogging at Tablet, and they were basically talking about how blogging's dead, about the death of blogging. Now, blogging never completely died; it's still around, but that particular ecosystem where the most kind of influential inside baseball pundits and kind of up-and-coming people challenging the establishment all had blogs, people like Ezra Klein and Matt Iglesias and so on, or Megan McArdle or whoever it was, or Andrew Sullivan, obviously, and they would all link to each other, and Glenn Greenwald came out of that system, and so on, and at some point, Twitter and Facebook killed that system because Facebook became about kind of content in isolation, getting as many views as possible, and nothing else could keep up. And sites like BuzzFeed became optimized for that. And then Twitter was never really about driving traffic, but for elite conversation, it was basically faster, more aggressive blogging with a lower barrier to entry. Those
initial people,
for most kind of offhand takes about the news, Twitter is the optimal platform. You can say as much or as little as you want, and it'll either get traction or it won't.
And those initial people entered the mainstream,
Klion
went to Washington Post, and then Vox, and then blah, blah, blah.
Right. They either ended up at big places, or they, in the case of Vox, started their own, or The Intercept. They graduated. But I will say, for instance, Andrew Sullivan is someone who, for the duration of the blog era, was an enormously influential figure. He never figured out Twitter. He was never really a great team player at publications, and he cost a lot, I think. And then he tried this experiment where he made his blog independent and paywalled, and it just, the economics weren't there, which is another way of saying he had been overpaid at the previous publications he worked for. And now he writes once a week for New York Magazine, and I'm sure he's doing fine, but I would say his influence has dropped off considerably. He basically couldn't, but his political views weren't really optimized for the Twitter sphere. And that is sort of what brings us to what's happened to the Times recently. So, to the Times op-ed page recently.
Right. Okay, so James Bennet, who was previously the editor of The Atlantic, was hired.
He was at The Atlantic for a long time.
Yeah, at least a decade, I
He
think.
was
And
he was an era-defining editor of the Atlantic. He
he had
made that the
Sullivan,
kind of he had Sullivan. He
he
had
had Coates, he had Iglesias, he had McCardle, he had Douthit.
yeah, no, he had a lot of these people. He made the Atlantic a big bloggy power player, often getting involved in controversies at the same time, like giving sponsored content to the Church of Scientology, or just various troll bait things by Caitlin Flanagan or Anne Marie Slaughter or whatever, often playing at upper middle class women's anxieties. Um, but but it was nothing like what's happened since he moved to the Times and promoted Jeffrey Goldberg to fill his shoes at the Atlantic. I have many criticisms of Goldberg, but I think it's fair to say he has definitely done a better job running the Atlantic than James Bennet has done running the Times opinion page. He has stayed out of trouble. And in
Well, is
fact,
that what is the winning strategy? One would
yeah,
ask.
well, actually, it's interesting. I'm gonna say some nice things about some people I don't generally feel warmly toward, Jeffrey Goldberg and David Frum. Both, all from that era of Iraq War promoters who, et cetera. I don't even feel like getting into it. Everybody knows. But I will say, okay, so Jeff Goldberg is clearly friends with David Frum. They're clearly social. They're clearly like-minded about a lot of things, but Frum is more of, right of center, and Goldberg is a little more left of center. And, there are a lot of people who reflexively hate Frum, and I understand why, and I don't fault that at all. But I will say, as never Trump conservatives go, stipulating as I will that I think the Never Trump movement is nonsense. I think it doesn't speak for any appreciable number of people. I wish the neocons would all go away. But given that they're not, and that we're kind of stuck with them regardless for now, David Frum is trying to say new and relevant things, and I think it's fair to say succeeding. I think it's fair to say that liberals who are not necessarily inclined to want to hear from him, they read him and they think he's describing important things about authoritarianism. And, if you've been following his career for a while, you can call him a hypocrite in various ways, and that's fair. You can say, what about the Bush era? And that's fair. But I think the writing he's doing now seems, as best as I can tell, like an honest attempt to grapple with what is happening right now. And often well written and thoughtful, and there is a defensible case for running those, and they're clearly popular. So let's contrast that to the approach that James Bennet has taken at the New York Times since he came on. Has it even been a year? I don't think it has been.
No, it has to be more than a year.
May or something. I don't think it's been that long.
I was thinking it was more like 2 years, but maybe I'm wrong.
No, it's definitely post-election because, okay, so Bennett came on from The Atlantic. The first major op-ed columnist he hired, Bret Stephens, was amazingly Pulitzer-winning, although so are lots of people. So is Maureen Dowd, so is Tom Friedman. It's amazing, who gets Pulitzers. But
Well, to give them to anyone these days.
I guess so. But Walter Duranty back in the day, covering for the crimes of Stalin. So, but really, we should just abolish the Pulitzer Prize. but he won it for standard neocon right of center commentary at the Wall Street Journal, and there was and his friend who was a sometime opinion contributor and books editor there, Barry Weiss, who I'm just going to say right now, I went to college with Barry. I used to know her pretty well. I don't really want to get into any of that here. And I'll probably be talking more about other people as a result. But, I'll give basic facts just because they're part of the story. Brett and Barry, as best as I understand it, came over from the Wall Street Journal to the New York Times, hired by Bennet at the same time, because as what was supposed to be a flattering profile of Weiss and that the JTA explained, the Wall Street Journal had become an increasingly hostile place for kind of neocon establishment conservative types. It had been more sympathetic to Trump, and Barry and Brett were on the anti-Trump never Trump bandwagon, like I'd say most neocons or fellow travelers were. Um, my thinking is if you speak for an ideology that should be discredited in and of itself for, the various wars it championed and the war on crime and all of this, and then on top of that has completely lost any sway within the Republican Party, so they can't make a case that they represent some large part of the country, my feeling is go away. I mean, if individual neocons like from, can maybe genuinely say something worthwhile, then sure, I guess, give them a chance. But like the idea that there just need to be neocons on every masthead forever, it's like I really think they speak for a circle of maybe 24 people tops. Like well-connected elite people who've been a sort of, Potemkin village for the Republican Party and what it's really about for a long time. That's my critique. I don't know why they're still around. James Bennet had a different theory, which is, no, we need more of that. The Wall Street Journal is pushing them out so it can have more pro-Trump voices. They could retire to the Weekly Standard or Commentary or wherever, or do something else with their lives. But no, I think they belong on the New York Times opinion page. I'm going to hire them before I hire any women of color as full-time contributors, before I hire anyone who supported or even like implied support for Bernie Sanders, who won almost half the Democratic electorate in the 2016 primaries, and almost all millennials, or over 80% of millennials, and I am biased, but I think any reasonable analysis would say that his views of social democracy are where the Democratic Party is trending and are broadly popular in polls, and he's popular, and it would be absurd not to have somebody speaking for that worldview. But in fact, he actually has hired one, I would say, solidly left of center columnist, Michelle Goldberg, who has written some good columns, but she was for Hillary. It's like they're just allergic.
I'm pretty sure that everyone who's on, every contributing opinion writer voted for Hillary Clinton.
Literally all of them.
Either in the primary,
conservatives did too,
or in the general election. Yeah.
Or I don't know if like Douthat voted for her, but he ostensibly did not vote for Trump. So, I mean, the Bennett in hilariously leaked memos, and I just want to give a shout out to Ashley Feinberg of the Huffington Post, who is a really excellent media reporter and just reporter generally, and writer, and turns in consistently funny and illuminating things, and manages to do really mean coverage while coming across as really nice, which is like a rare talent and one I really respect. Anyway, the New York Times staffers do not like this situation on the op-ed page, and boy, have they been leaking to her. And they've leaked, various transcripts and conversations with Bennett and recordings that make him seem hopelessly out of touch and clueless, and saying things like, well, we're trying to get diverse points of view and trying to hear all sides and all this, but then he's like, well, the New York Times is a capitalist paper and we support capitalism. And it's like, the only interesting, fresh points of view are the ones challenging neoliberal capitalism from the left and the right, whether that's, Bernie Sanders style leftism or people who are well to the left of him who are making intelligent critiques, real socialists and communists and anarchists and so on, who places like Jacobin, or any number of other places. And then it's also, I'm wary of promoting this kind of stuff, but there are voices on the right that are, I actually thought the Times did do one thing right in the last week, the Times op-ed page, which was to run Daniel McCarthy, the editor-in-chief of the American Conservative, in a piece making, a eloquent, well-argued, I don't think correct, but serious, and I'm sure sincerely meant case for economic nationalism and protectionism, and basically the smartest version of what Trump and Bannon ostensibly stand for. And I definitely support running an op-ed like that. I don't support running, dozens of op-eds like that every week, but I think that is a real worldview that would get sometimes people outside their bubble. But that's not where Bennett's at. Bennett just wanted, sorry about that. Bennett just wanted, to have right of center trolls who, half the time agree with the average liberal Times reader on everything, so they don't add any viewpoint diversity. They all went to the same schools and came from the same handful of places and so on, live in the same handful of places. And then when they're not saying that, they're saying something egregiously wrong and trolling. And of course, the most popular thing, and this must be an obsession of Bennett's because it's an obsession of people at The Atlantic like Connor Friedersdorf, and then it's an obsession of Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss, and for that matter, David Brooks, who actually also, I think, was at The Atlantic in some capacity at some point, and Ross Douthat, although he's smarter about it. But basically, all of these people are obsessed with the same thing, which is the supposed scourge of illiberalism and censorship on college campuses. And I have gotten increasingly angry and outspoken on this subject because it's a fraud.
Yeah.
And there's increasing evidence that it's a fraud. And actually, Matt Iglesias had a very good rundown in Vox with, data, what they're good at. Vox, by the way, I want to say, good publication. It takes some crap from the left, but I generally approve of what they do. I think they do. I think they show that it's possible to have smart, substantive, data-driven, contextualized, accessible journalism that has a clear bias, which I would say is the bias of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, not the left, but, the idealistic young millennial progressives, and to do that, in a way that, they definitely had some hiccups early on, but that I would say in general is not embarrassing, which, honestly, how many DC-based publications can you say that about these days? But I think, and they can call out bullshit. Matt Iglesias in particular, I think, understands that the Republican Party is a radical right party, and he doesn't mince words about it. And he uses data and history and evidence to make that case. And it's not just him being like a ranty partisan. He understands that could be objectively true and it could be demonstrated. And, whereas there is partisan media that's just going to yell at the other side in a lazy way, no matter what, and cover up the blemishes of its own side, which actually Vox did its fair bit of during the campaign, but I think they're a lot better now. And then there's also, phony both sidesism, where no matter what one side is saying, it has exact moral equivalence with the other side. So, they can push the envelope all the way to Trump and beyond and to straight up Nazis and still be treated as respectable. So we're, that was a huge tangent. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
But we're with the campus thing. There's just not a scourge of students on campuses shooting down speakers. It has happened in a handful of high-profile campuses. The speakers who are being shot down are always, I would say, highly questionable figures, or at least the most prominent examples are people like Charles Murray, who, burned a cross in his youth and preposterously tells us he didn't know what it meant, who is most famous for writing a book arguing in completely scientifically garbage ways that there's a biological correlation between race and IQ, and basically trying to mainstream eugenics. Students, I think, have a right to want to shut this guy down, to not give him a respected platform. Christina Hoff Sommers, the American Enterprise Institute quote unquote scholar, who, as far as I can tell, has done no substantial scholarship in her life, is an absolute troll and called me out for my mental health totally out of the blue, just tweeted at me a week or so ago at a completely random tweet of mine and said, "David's off his meds again." And then I humiliated her over it, and she apologized, and she revealed she was drunk in an airport. So these are not intellectually impressive people. She apologized, but she apologized to me for being a jerk, but not for stigmatizing mentally ill people, which is what I wanted her to apologize for. And then she got pissy at me because I wasn't accepting her apology, and neither did anyone else think I should. So, these are the people that it's ostensibly so important. Or then there's Milo Yiannopoulos, the confessed pedophile. And, all of these people are trolls, frauds, and hucksters who deliberately go to elite liberal arts campuses, where a very tiny, percentage of the college-educated population goes, in order to, set off these incidents. And I can sort of see you preparing to say, well, why are the kids taking the bait?
Well, I mean, the kids basically need to learn that they're doing no one a service by taking the bait, and then maybe this lesson will take 5 more years to sink in. But
I think there's a legitimate debate to be had on that, and if I were an undergraduate involved in political discourse, I might well be having that debate with the kids doing that. Although I'm increasingly sympathetic to their view. But,
who gives a shit about Christina Hoff Sommers? Very few people really take her seriously in any way. But suddenly we're hearing about, she's at Lewis and Clark College or whatever, and she gets shouted down by 15 students. So she gets in the news, so she wins. I mean, the students get to have fun because they get to march around and yell and have posters and stuff. But then it's ultimately a victory for her because we're talking about her when really she doesn't matter at all.
Well, okay, so this is something I think I can definitely push back on, because John Chait, who was actually debating me last week after I got into this little squabble with Christina Hoff Sommers, and he and I had a civil debate. I have some respect for him, whereas I have no respect for Sommers or Murray or Milo or any of them. But we were talking about sort of which speech matters and which speech doesn't. And then he's also been talking a lot about why is everyone picking on Bari Weiss? Leave her alone. Or why is everyone, picking on any of these? Why is everyone picking on me, Jonathan Chait? Leave me alone. Because he comes in for a lot of hate from the left. And I think the answer to that is pretty clear. There's power dynamics involved. There are a handful of major brand name publications in this country and TV shows and stuff and universities. There are a handful of people who get paid real livings, pretty lucrative livings to express opinions. I believe in opinion journalism, and it's something that runs through, my life and my career. It's something I care about. It's something I grew up reading, and something I write still for various publications. It's what Blogging Heads is all about. And I take it seriously. I think that people should say things that matter. Otherwise, it's pointless. Otherwise, we don't need to have opinion journalism at all. So I think there's something deeply disingenuous. And then I would throw in the think tank world with this too, right? I mean, Sommers is at AEI. I think Murray is too, or he certainly was. He has books out. I think she may have a book. Milo had a book deal until Roxane Gay and other people managed to get that killed, and honestly, good for them. But I think they do matter. I think it's totally disingenuous for someone like John Chait to go out and be like, why do people like me and my friend Barry and all these other people matter? You do or you don't. If you want to be in the arena discussing things, then you should be prepared to take serious criticism when you're wrong, and as they often are.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's a difference between the no platform thing and disagreeing strenuously in a civil or semi-civil way. The no platform thing just seems like such a shooting yourself in the foot every time you do it, because it just creates a circus-like atmosphere, and it gets a lot of attention and publicity for the person who's being no platform. Now, some people are truly repellent, like Richard Spencer and Milo Yiannopoulos, and you could say he should not speak at my college campus. He is a white supremacist. Okay. But when you drag it down to Christina Hoff Sommers, who's just a dime a dozen,
who by the way,
feminist critic
podcast and did not call out anything on it.
Right. So she's white supremacist curious or something.
All of these people are a degree removed from it. Jordan Peterson, the guy who you hear about a lot these days, who's really something, is a degree removed from the alt-right. I mean, he certainly has a lot of fans in that world, and he dog whistles to them. Charles Murray certainly does. I mean, they're able to parlay
the liberal or leftist backlash to them into like more attention for themselves, which is for a lot of them what they want in the end. So I think it's just a stupid strategy for like college activists to pursue. But anyway, yeah, there is no like national epidemic of
No,
like illiberalism on college campuses.
no,
It does
and
not
it's and
deserve
it's
the attention
also
it's getting.
and it's also, I mean, I think your point that it draws more attention to them than they otherwise would get is probably true. But at the same time, they are public figures. They do have platforms regardless, which is kind of the point. That, these are people who go on TV, who get op-eds in various places, who get book deals. So it's not like they have a platform regardless. So the question is, when they come to the college, does the college want to honor them? Does the college want, and I don't even mean, does it want to honor them because they're, good people, or because, or does it only want to honor liberals? And one of I think the biggest, canards about this whole debate is when people are like, you just want to hear people who agree with you. I mean, you and I are on left of center Twitter all day. Do you think everybody who is left of center agrees with everyone else who does?
Yeah, yeah. It's not just
you and I are having a very civil and very reasonable disagreement right now about no platforming. Like, differences of opinions exist in all kinds of places, and conservatives can have legitimate ones too. But that's not what I really object to. Is these people are not scholars or intellectuals. They're frauds and provocateurs, and the campus is bringing them on. Like, you could say the students are creating the incident, but let's be real. They are coming to the campus to create an incident. And ultimately, like, maybe students are playing into their hands, but I have decided my responsibility, to the extent I have a platform and I'm weighing in on these things, is to take the side of the students who are standing up to bigots and hucksters, who are still forming their views, who are young and, excitable in various ways, but who I find, by and large, first of all, are standing for justice and not injustice, and second, are generally articulating their points better. And I would like to shout down people like Summers in the public sphere too. I would like to. I mean, she has a right to speak, and if people want to fund her to have a platform, then they can. But I would like to. I would like to have voices calling that out. I would like to have more voices calling that out. What I don't want is for the most important liberal media institution in the country, the New York Times, to be constantly running, not just conservative takes. I'm fine with running some conservative takes, but running, basically whitewashings of people like Summers and Murray and Ben Shapiro, who's a huge racist. But I guess Barry Weiss likes him because she read a whole column about how he's actually one of the good ones, and then there was a news article about how he's actually one of the good ones. This is someone who, says Arabs live in sewage, and that Elizabeth Warren smokes a peace pipe or whatever. I mean, he's a racist. But I mean, it was weird. Another huge screw up that Bennet had was he hired this woman, Quinn Norton, and fired her 6 hours later. And I was not impressed with her when I took a look at her. I didn't know much about her before, but she did seem to be a sort of an iconoclastic voice, at least, which was something. But it turned out that she has an active, ongoing friendship with a literal neo-Nazi named Weave, who she stands by no matter what, even though she says he's a horrible person.
Yeah, that the whole incident was bizarre.
It was bizarre, and that really, she was being brought on the editorial board. It suggested this is not someone with great editorial judgment, someone who, is going to die on the hill of being friends with a Nazi. But then I look at that, and then I look at, Barry, who is standing up for Ben Shapiro, and I'm like, these are really like very marginal. Like, Ben Shapiro and Barry know how to play the game. They know how to make their racism socially acceptable. They know how to color within the lines, and Bret Stephens knows how to do that, which is what the Republican Party has done our whole life. And Quinn Norton, who's I don't even think is a conservative, but made the mistake of making friends with an avowed racist who is like, doesn't euphemize it at all, and that's why she can't be there. I think it is really disturbing how many op-eds the Times and then the Atlantic and other places are running basically making it seem like the most important thing happening in the world of these campus speech debates. It is wildly outsized attention. I think their point of view is wrong. I think that the students are expressing free speech. I mean, I understand why you wouldn't condone violence, physical violence. I understand why no one should condone censorship, and I am not calling for any of the people I've named today to be censored for, they all have very big platforms. That's the point. But what they really want is safe spaces, the term that they're always making fun of. They want safe spaces for right-wing trolls to go to campus and say horrible things and only be politely challenged. And I don't think that's right. I don't want that. I think even if you don't believe in no platforming, even if your objections to that are noted, what I think is absolutely the correct response to someone like Summer speaking on your campus, bring signs, bring rude, angry signs, mob the place with those, and then at question time, lay into her. Like, don't hold back, don't be polite. But I don't blame people if they want to take it one step further. I mean, I don't think she is entitled to that platform. I don't think she's entitled to the sort of respectability that the platform confers.
Well, I mean, how much respectability is it? Because it's like the college Republican group, which probably consists of like a dozen people, invites someone to come speak at like a lecture hall at 7 p.m. on a Wednesday. This is not like, being granted an honorary diploma or something.
No, it's not. But you start to rack up like, her as she'll be like, I've, presented on the campuses of Yale and Harvard and Stanford and all, that there's a way you build this kind of thing, and it normalized. I mean, let's put it this way. Everyone who thinks that this is a free speech thing, I think, agrees that like a literal Klansman should not speak, in his robe or whatever, should not speak on a campus, right? Or should not burn a cross in the middle of the Columbia campus or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what precisely is the distinction being defended in saying that Charles Murray, who did burn a cross and who was seen by, I think, like the Southern Poverty Law Center might see him as racist, but, he has this AEI respectability and he's friends with a lot of more mainstream pundits. Like, what exactly is it that makes him okay and makes the Klansman not okay? Like, we've already conceded that there's an absolute right to free speech at the point of you don't get put in jail. And Congress can't pass laws censoring you. But as far as like appearing in polite society, being welcomed as a guest in universities, like we all agree that that's not absolute.
Yeah.
In fact, Barry Weiss, as has been repeatedly documented, and I was there, devoted much of her undergraduate career to aggressively no platforming Middle East studies professors, mostly of Arab and or Muslim background, and while she maintains that she was not trying to get them fired, this is slightly disingenuous if you know anything about how tenure committees work. Basically she was trying to poison their reputation so they could never get tenure. Now, she has the right to do that, honestly. I mean, I think other people have the right to push back. I think it was gross and McCarthyist in a lot of ways, but it is protected speech what she was doing, and I think she has the right to do it. But I don't understand how you can do that and be completely unrepentant about that, and also do things like smear Linda Sarsour by association with Louis Farrakhan, and have her be responsible for everything he's ever said in the pages of the New York Times, and then claim that Christina Hoff Sommers or Barry Weiss or whoever is being no platformed. Like, that doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I agree.
Blatant hypocrisy.
Yeah, the hypocrisy by Weiss is striking. I would like to say I emailed Bari Weiss at what I believe is her email address, and I didn't get a bounce back to invite her onto Blogging Heads and received no response. So, Bari, if you're listening to this, the offer still stands if you'd like to come on and discuss some of these issues.
But actually, Aryeh, in many ways, that gets to my exact point. She doesn't need Blogging Heads because she's been on Bill Maher twice in the last month or so. Whereas, lowly Twitterers like you or I, this or podcasts or whatever. I mean, honestly, my best platform, if I may say so, is my Twitter account. Like, I reach a bigger audience there than I ever reached getting published anywhere, including the New York Times op-ed page. But but the point is, like, we don't. Barry Weiss is not lacking for prestige platforms right now. Barry Weiss is not lacking for access.
Right.
Barry Weiss is the least censored person in America. What she
Yeah,
is yet for being wrong.
I was thinking that she's the real queen of all media because she manages. I mean, we've been talking about her for like 2 months straight, and it's not like she's really done something impressive to gain that level. But yeah, do you want to talk about cars for a little bit before we wrap up?
Gosh, we have been going on a long time, haven't we?
Yeah, we've gone about an hour.
Yeah, we have. Well, there's a lot to say on this topic. Clearly, I have a lot to say on this topic. We didn't even really scratch the surface of, the kind of trolling Bret Stephens does. Or, you know what I want to say before we leave that all together? People will be like, oh, it doesn't matter. They're just columnists. Okay, at the very least, it matters because, the New York Times is devoting precious resources to these salaries when, meanwhile, they've laid off half their copy desk. And now I see copy errors all the time, all over the place. And, they could be hiring more reporters to cover more things, to cover poor communities of color, to cover, foreign bureaus, to cover the arts, which they've been cutting. I mean, there are so many really substantive things they could do. And there's so many really good reporters at the Times. For instance, there's Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohy, who narrowly beat Ronan Farrow to break the Weinstein story, and by extension start the Me Too movement, which I don't want to get too much into the actual Me Too movement right now, but I think it's fair to say is one of the most important cultural upheavals of recent history.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, we were making fun of the Pulitzer before, but they certainly deserve it. And the most important,
every bit as important as the gay marriage revolution or trans rights or Black Lives Matter.
I think their article was the most. Was the most effective, or the article with like the biggest impact since like the Pentagon Papers.
No one doubts that. They set it off, and then it was kind of a 1-2 punch with Farrow, which is to say the New York Times has changed the world in the last several months in incredible ways, in ways that I think are overwhelmingly positive. But meanwhile, there is this sort of attempt to gin up a backlash. And where is it coming from? It's coming from the New York Times op-ed page, where there's concern trolling from Bret Stephens and Barry Weiss. It's coming from the formerly James Bennet run Atlantic, where Caitlin Flanagan is doing it. It's coming from Katie Royfee, who seems to be on the same page and possibly friends with all these people. And they're making what I think are bad faith, disingenuous, and often really offensive arguments that don't give the women who are leading this movement a lot of credit for seriousness, and that are just in no way helpful, and really undermine people are like, oh, we want to start debate, we want to start free speech. You know who's starting debate and free speech? The Me Too movement, as set off by Kantor and Twohy, right? Like, they are getting people to say things that they were afraid to say. They're getting people to tell the truth in all media about men who were protected by just a culture of fear. I mean, you want to talk about the suppression of free speech? How about Harvey Weinstein hiring Mossad agents to like stalk all the women that he's raped and harassed so they never say anything? I mean, that's the suppression of free speech. That's real no platforming, right? And like and the way you I believe in punditry and opinion journalism and opinionated analysis. I believe strongly in it. But like, the most important thing journalists can do is report on the powerful and expose them and empower regular people to speak about what they're doing. And that's what Times reporters have done. The opinion section has not only not done anything remotely comparable to that, but I think is actually trying to undo that and failing, I think. But like, I just see it as a fundamental insult. And I will say, although this is a little catty of me, that as my Twitter following has grown, New York Times writers and editors keep following me. And I absolutely will not give any identifying details about any of them, as well as, friends and family of them, sometimes sliding into my DMs. I would say between that and the fact that other people who are putting out the same kind of criticisms as me have said this as well, and the stuff that Ashley Feinberg's reported at the Huffington Post, it's pretty clear there's a lot of anger at the Times newsroom, where Dean Baquet, whatever, God, I should know how to pronounce his name, has imposed this draconian social media policy where no one who works there is basically allowed to have any public opinions about anything ever.
Yeah.
Which I think is insane. And so it leads to a lot of them subtweeting or liking tweets insulting their colleagues or DMing people or leaking stories to other media outlets. I couldn't tell you what the scale of it is. I'm not sure anyone could, but there is a lot of rage being suppressed, and a lot of it is racialized also. A lot of people who are like, why is so much white mediocrity? Not just the wrong opinions and the trolling, but inaccurate information, frauds that get published and have to be corrected. Why is this all being permitted on the op-ed page while everyone else is trying to do hard work? And in the recordings that were released, there were unidentified apparent journalists of color saying that they feel like it's a hostile work environment for them, that there's this pass to sort of troll the libs from the right for these white people who don't follow basic journalistic standards, who can't be bothered to do fact checking.
Yeah, it really does seem like there's a different standard to which some of these people in question are held. And
it sure does. It sure does. And I've been accused of being personally mean by people that I know socially and people who are friends. And all I can say is, I understand why this is hard. I understand that, but everything I'm saying is true and it resonates. And that's the point of journalism. And I don't feel like journalists and people who went to the same schools and so on should just protect each other, out of some sense of elite loyalty or whatever. Journalists are supposed to tell the truth. And certainly if opinion journalists are going to go around smearing people's reputations, they should get their facts right. I am kind of unimpressed by people who are unwilling to do that, unwilling to apologize when they get things wrong, unwilling to apologize when they do things like try to get a freelancer fired by her clients for really no apparent reason, and then lying to reporters at the Washington Post about what actually went down there. I mean, I feel righteously indignant about this, and I think that I'm right to, and I think that everyone else who's been complaining is right to as well. On behalf of the many, many, many journalists out there who take their work seriously and are losing jobs all over the place because the industry is collapsing, and it's sort of a standing insult to see what gets rewarded and what doesn't.
If you were granted for 24 hours the powers of James Bennet, and you were able to hire or fire whoever you wanted on the op-ed page.
You should have let me prep this. I know what you're going to ask.
Yeah, who would you hire? Who do you think is the socialist or leftist opinion writer who should be hired? Who should the actual Trump supporter like heaven forbid they hire someone who actually voted for Donald J. Trump, as 45 million of our countrymen did.
I go back and forth on that second point on whether it's a good idea or not. I mean, I think on one level, I would respect the idea of, we need to hear this perspective, and is there anyone who can articulate it convincingly, and maybe we should give that person a column. The reality is, though, of course, that person would probably be not only not the most articulate scholar or whatever, but also, you and I both know, and frankly, everyone on the Times op-ed page knows, that the essence of Trumpism is bigotry, and that a truly unvarnished look at it would be bigotry. So I can see the case for Trump. I can certainly see the case for, what I said with McCarthy, or someone like maybe Michael Brendan Dougherty, or sometimes Ross Douthat, or other people or a lot of people who passed through the American Conservative, who could make the case for a more isolationist foreign policy, or for more economic nationalism. I could definitely see running some stuff like that, but I'm skeptical of a reflexive Trump defender because I basically think Trump is indefensible. And I think that the Times could do a good job of covering why people vote for him. And I think, frankly, a better job than they have done. But I don't really think there are intelligent arguments to be made on his behalf. I think that I think when they attempt to do it is when they gave their whole op-ed page to Trump supporters. What ends up happening is a lot of lies and bullshit get published and just preposterous statements that aren't even worth seriously engaging with, because he's created an alternate reality where facts don't matter, and you don't. I don't really believe you can be an intellectually serious and honest person and defend that reality. I think you can defend some of the. I think you can attack liberalism for the ways that it facilitated that reality in some way. You can also attack mainstream conservatism for that. I think you can talk about how, free trade policies and so on, or unfettered immigration. I mean, that has a very dangerous racial subtext to it. But you can talk about how things like that, about how globalization, about how I would, on the left, emphasize inequality. To really challenge New York Times readers and get them out of their comfort zones, you don't do that by having a irrelevant person like Bret Stephens, blatantly troll them. That just pisses them off and confirms their view that Republicans are trolls, correctly. But what actually would challenge them would be somebody who questions the things that Bret Stephens agrees with them on, somebody who questions basically the economic and social consensus of the last 40 years. And I think someone like James Bennet is unwilling or possibly even incapable of imagining what that would look like, even though it's all around. So to the question, who would I have on the left? I mean, there's an embarrassment of riches, really. Ideally, it would be someone who's not a white man. So I guess some of the more obvious names that come to mind would be people like Bhaskar Sankara, who founded Jacobin, Sarah Jones, who I am friendly with, who writes for the New Republic, Elizabeth Brunig, who's at the Post right now, and actually is an iconoclastic person. I mean, she on what I consider a pretty core issue, abortion rights, she sometimes is in a more wavering place, but she's brilliant, a generous writer, an intellectually honest writer, and clearly of the left. Her husband, Matt, is also a very important left voice, I think. A lot of people at The Intercept, with probably more of a national security focus, which would be totally new for the Times to have that perspective. I think someone like my friend Ryan Cooper just does week after week, or multiple times a week, incredibly substantive, well-argued, decidedly left, timely, newsy takes. He proves that can be done. That you can just be smart and on the news and opinionated, but evidence-based. I think it doesn't even have to be that far left. I mean, I think like Adam Serwer is doing amazing work at The Atlantic. I think there are just so many. I think there's a writer named Tressie McMillan Cottom. She's an academic, I think, in Virginia. And she does wonderful writing on kind of the intersection of race and class. And I mean, I could go on and on forever, but I think there are so many fresh voices who could be on that page. And that's just, instead we got Bret Stephens.
Yeah. I mean, that statement that Bennett made that the New York Times believes in capitalism, was very telling. And, there are many more people who do not believe in capitalism who are compatriots in this nation, and there are more of them every day.
More true as time goes on. I think the Times is. I think what grates about the Barry hiring in particular, as she's actually one of a number of older millennial opinion editors that they hired in the last year, some of whom are quite good, and one of whom I worked with, but I'm definitely naming no names here. But she's the only one who writes, which I find odd. And not quite as a staff columnist, but as a pretty regular contributor. And I find it strange that in a generation that is overwhelmingly progressive, and then within that overwhelmingly for Bernie, and also for kind of intersectional issues, and I find it very weird that the only regular millennial voice in the New York Times in 2018 is someone who I think would describe herself as a liberal, but like, I'm not sure all liberals would accept that designation, and somewhere between that and neocon, but definitely unrepresentative of where her generation is moving, and of the many publications and online multimedia presences in which people are becoming really important voices, and I just think that's a shame that those voices aren't front and center. I think the Times is, I mean, they could still do it, maybe not under Bennet, I don't know, but I think the Times is blowing an opportunity to embrace, what the next generation of progressive thinking is, and instead they're kind of leaving behind these liberal boomer dinosaurs and then bringing in trolls, and it's hard to say whose interest is being served besides the trolls themselves.
Yeah. I would just speak up for. I mean, they need to hire someone who supports Trump. Like that, half the country supported him. We may think these people are misguided, but we're stuck with them, and we need to know how Trump supporters think. And if there's no internal logic to how they think, then that will be displayed in the column that doesn't hold together, so we can critique it. But the fact that they can't find anyone it's like.
Well, but who would you name? Who has found someone? Who is the smartest pro-Trump writer?
I mean, there's someone like Scott McConnell or someone like that. I mean, I don't think Doherty didn't vote for Trump, but Doherty writes about the things that kind of the ideal populist Trump would have.
You take my point, right? Like, it's difficult to get to one.
Yeah, I agree. It is.
The New York Times. It's basically difficult.
It's hard to find an intellectually serious person who can consistently make the case for Trump. I agree, it's hard, but when they already had their two House conservatives were never Trump, bringing in some additional never Trump people, when the never Trump conservatives represent at most like 2% of the country, it just was such a stupid move.
It was, but the other thing is they think of them as intellectually serious, and then we start digging into that, and it's like, well, how intellectually serious is Bret Stephens really? I mean, he knows the right things to say to not get pushed out of liberal company, but like, I think he makes specious and fraudulent and misleading arguments all the time. I think he's basically a huckster too. I mean, I think that the Republican Party for my entire lifetime has been run that way. I make no apologies about saying that. And I believe that my analysis, my opinions, everything I say is stronger for being completely clear on that. And everybody who dances around that or tries to make it not true is distorting reality rather than dealing with reality. The reality is there is a far-right extremist party that is one of our two major parties. And if the election of Donald Trump doesn't get people to see that clearly, I don't know what would. Like, it just the people are in deep denial.
Yeah, I basically agree with you. I've harped on Twitter for a while about the conservative movement being a scam, and it was taken over by the greatest con artists in the country, and then the con artist
Perrine has written brilliantly.
Pull a con on the entire country, and that's where we are today. Why don't we end it there?
Let's not do cards today.
Let's end it there. So, are there pieces or anything you want to plug before we leave?
I shouldn't jinx it, but I think I have a piece coming out in The Nation next week, so I guess watch out for that. It'll be about my favorite real subject, which is Russia and Russiagate. People can read my case in the foreword that looks like a troll case, but I actually think is right and substantive, that was published just the other day, where I argue that these remarks Putin made in an interview with Megyn Kelly that were interpreted as anti-Semitic actually were not, and were pretty innocuous in a Russian context. And I go into the history of Jews in Russia, something I know a lot about. And actually, an example of not everyone agreeing, even if they're sort of in the broad same camp. A writer I know socially named Talia Lavin, who's a fact checker at The New Yorker, also Jewish, also writes about Russia and speaks Russian. She and I got into it on Twitter. It was heated over whether Putin was an anti-Semite or not, and we ended up both writing directly dueling op-eds for the Jewish Daily Forward, in which we took both sides of that debate. I, of course, think that I won, but people can go and read both and see for themselves. We both made intelligent and respectful arguments. And also Talia, who's came out the day after mine, directly references mine, which is something New York Times op-ed writers are forbidden from doing. They're not allowed to address each other directly. And there was a period when like Paul Krugman and David Brooks were like subtweeting each other in their columns, which is funny, but also like, this is stupid. Like, people are adults. Your readers are adults. Your writers are or should be adults. Like, everywhere else it's having a more intelligent conversation than what's going on the pages of the Times right now, with notable exceptions, such as, of course, my Times op-ed on how the left should frame the Russiagate thing, which was perfect and flawless.
I want to mention briefly two pieces I put on my blog. One is a logical proof showing that Donald Trump is a moron, which is in about 200 words. I proved it for all time. You can't use facts and logic. And I don't care about your feelings because I use facts. And the other is a humor piece that I wrote imagining Trump stopping an active shooter. So I'll include links to those two things.
Wow.
So Dave...
Did he use the Meghan McArdle method of rushing the shooter?
Well, I don't want to spoil anything. Let's just say he has his long tie and he throws the tie and he's able to grab the gun like that. So it's along those lines.
I'll have to check it out.
So Dave, thanks for coming on. Thanks to all of our viewers and listeners. And we'll see
all three of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for sticking with it. And we'll see you again next time.
Bye-bye.